In the summer of 1907, a French corset maker named Herminie Cadol stood in her Paris workshop holding two pieces of fabric and boning that she had just cut apart from each other. For 300 years, the garment beneath a woman's dress had been one long, rigid structure running from collarbone to hip. Cadol had just done something almost nobody had dared to do. She had cut it in half. The top half she called the soutien-gorge. The bottom half stayed a corset, for now. Within a few decades, that top half would be renamed, redesigned, and sold to millions of women under a word that barely existed before the 20th century: the bra. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What did women wear for the thousands of years before that? The answer is stranger, more inventive, and in some cases, more surprising than you'd expect. Women bound, they wrapped, they laced, they stitched pockets into their dresses and stuffed them with wool. They wore devices made of whalebone that could crack ribs and simple linen bands that modern designers are now trying to recreate. Some of it was about comfort, some of it was about survival, and a shocking amount of it was about controlling exactly how a woman's body was allowed to look. This is the story of what came before the bra, and why understanding it changes the way you think about the clothes in your own drawer right now. If you've ever wondered why women's undergarments carry so much history, so much politics, and so much pain, stick around. By the end of this, you'll never look at a bra the same way again. And if stories like this, the hidden history behind everyday objects, are the kind of thing you enjoy, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let's go back further than most people expect. Not to the Victorian era, not even to the Renaissance. Let's go back roughly 2,000 years, to the Roman Empire. In 2008, archaeologists working in a castle in Lemberg, Austria, made a discovery that upended what historians thought they knew. Buried beneath the floorboards of the building, sealed away for roughly 600 years, they found textile fragments that looked unmistakably like bras, cups, shoulder straps, a structure built specifically to support and separate the breasts. The fragments were dated to the 15th century, nearly 500 years before Herminie Cadol cut her corset in two. That discovery forced textile historians to reconsider everything. If something resembling a modern bra existed in medieval Austria, what else had been lost, overlooked, or dismissed by earlier generations of scholars who simply assumed women's undergarments weren't worth studying? Go back further still, to ancient Greece and Rome, and you find something called the strophium, later referred to by some Romans as the mamellar. It was a simple band of leather or linen wrapped around the torso, worn either as the sole support garment or beneath a tunic. Roman mosaics uncovered at the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily, dating to around the 4th century, show women engaged in athletic competition wearing what looks remarkably like a modern bikini, a strophium across the chest, a loincloth below. For centuries, historians assumed those mosaics depicted something unusual or ceremonial. But the more textile fragments researchers uncovered, the clearer it became that breast bands were not an isolated curiosity. They were common, practical, worn by athletes, by working women, by anyone who needed support during movement. And yet almost none of it survived in written record. Ancient authors rarely bothered to describe the mundane details of a woman's undergarments. It wasn't considered worth writing down, which raises an uncomfortable truth that runs through this entire story. The history of what women wore beneath their clothes has always been at the mercy of what men in power considered worth preserving. So when the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe entered what we now call the medieval period, something happened to that early ingenuity. It didn't disappear completely, but it changed shape, and the reason why has everything to do with religion, class, and a growing obsession with controlling the female form. By the early Middle Ages, most European women wore a simple linen undergarment called a shift or chemise. It was loose, it was functional. For women with modest chest sizes, it may have offered enough incidental support on its own. For others, it did nothing at all, and daily life simply proceeded without any specialized garment underneath. But something was shifting, no pun intended, in how European society viewed the female body. As Christian doctrine spread and moral codes tightened around modesty and sin, the visible outline of a woman's figure became something to manage, minimize, and in some cases, actively disguise. By the 12th and 13th centuries, a new garment began appearing across Europe: the kirtle. Worn over the shift and under the outer gown, the kirtle was fitted snugly through the torso, sometimes laced tightly at the sides or back. It wasn't designed with breast support as its primary purpose. It was designed to shape the body into the silhouette fashion demanded: flat-chested, elongated, almost childlike in its lack of curve. Here's the uncomfortable irony worth sitting with. The very first garments resembling structured support were not created to help women. They were created to suppress them, to flatten a natural body shape that medieval fashion considered undesirable or even immodest. That tension between support and suppression would define undergarment history for the next 600 years. By the late 1300s, the kirtle evolved into something stiffer. Wealthy women began adding stiffened linen, sometimes reinforced with paste made from flour and water, hardened like early cardboard, sewn into the bodice to create rigidity. This was the ancestor of what would eventually become the corset. And crucially, this technology was expensive. Access to a supportive, structured undergarment became a marker of class. Poor and working women, meanwhile, continued relying on the loose shift, sometimes tightening it with a simple cord or sash beneath the bust. There was no single history of what women wore. There were parallel histories, one for the women who could afford structure and one for the women who couldn't. That division would only deepen with the arrival of one of history's most infamous garments. Picture Catherine de' Medici, arriving in the French court in 1533 as a teenage bride from Florence. Legend, though historians now debate how much of it is true, claims she banned thick waists at court, demanding that her ladies achieve a measurement no larger than 13 inches. True or exaggerated, the story reflects something real. By the 16th century, the aristocratic female silhouette had become a battlefield of rigid control. The corset, sometimes called a pair of bodies in English records of the period, emerged as a garment of two symmetrical, stiffened panels laced together. Whalebone, actually baleen, the flexible cartilage from a whale's mouth, became the material of choice. It was strong, springy, and could be cut into thin strips and sewn into channels to create rigid boning throughout the garment. Some corsets of this era went further still. Iron corsets, hinged and locking, appeared in wealthy European courts, allegedly used for medical correction of the spine as often as for fashion. Whether widely worn or largely mythologized by later historians remains debated, but the existence of the design itself tells you something about the lengths a society was willing to go to shape a woman's body into an idealized form. Here's where the story gets genuinely troubling. Tight lacing, practiced to its most extreme by some aristocratic and later Victorian women, could cause real physical harm: compressed ribs, displaced organs, difficulty breathing, fainting spells, so common among tightly laced women that the fainting couch became standard furniture in fashionable homes. Doctors of the 18th and 19th centuries wrote pamphlets warning against the practice, blaming corsets for everything from fatigue to infertility. Some of it exaggerated for moral panic, some of it grounded in real physiological consequence. And yet, here is the twist that most documentaries about corsets skip entirely. For the vast majority of history, and for the vast majority of women, corsets were not instruments of torture. They were work garments. Textile historian evidence from the 18th and 19th centuries shows that most working-class and middle-class women wore corsets that were laced for support and posture, not for dramatic waist reduction. A servant, a farmer's wife, a shopkeeper, she needed a corset that let her bend, lift, and labor through a 12-hour day. Extreme tight lacing was largely confined to a narrow slice of wealthy, fashionable society, immortalized disproportionately in illustrations and satirical cartoons that shaped how we remember the era today. The corset, in other words, was never one garment. It was dozens of garments, wearing the same name, serving radically different purposes depending on who wore it and why. But by the final decades of the 19th century, a growing chorus of women, doctors, reformers, and ordinary wearers alike, had started asking a dangerous question. What if the corset wasn't necessary at all? In 1873, a British reformer named Ada Ballin began publishing articles condemning the corset as a threat to women's health, part of a growing dress reform movement that stretched from London to Boston to Berlin. These women weren't just fashion critics. Many were physicians, suffragists, and early feminists who saw the corset as a physical manifestation of a larger cultural cage. Amelia Bloomer, whose name became attached to reform trousers worn beneath shortened skirts, argued that women's clothing had been designed by men for the visual pleasure of men, with total disregard for women's mobility, health, or comfort. It was a radical claim for its time, and it made her a target of ridicule in newspapers across 2 continents. The dress reform movement never fully succeeded in eliminating the corset, but it planted an idea that would take root for decades, that a woman's undergarments could, and should, be designed around function rather than restriction. Then, in 1889, Herminie Cadol unveiled her invention at the Paris Exposition. She called it the corselet gorge, a 2-piece undergarment that separated support of the bust from the compression of the waist. It wasn't an overnight sensation. Corsets remained the dominant undergarment for another 2 decades. But Cadol had planted a seed that a new generation of women, entering factories and offices in unprecedented numbers, were about to need desperately, because history was about to hand women a reason to abandon the corset that had nothing to do with fashion at all. In 1917, with the United States deep into the First World War, the War Industries Board made an announcement that sounds almost absurd today. American women were asked to stop buying corsets, not for health reasons, not for feminist reasons. For steel, corsets of the era relied on metal boning, and the US government estimated that eliminating corset production could free up roughly 28,000 tons of steel, enough, by some contemporary estimates, to build 2 entire battleships. Whether every figure repeated in later accounts is perfectly precise, the core fact holds. The war effort directly accelerated the corset's decline in a way that decades of health warnings and feminist arguments never had. Women who gave up their corsets needed something to wear underneath their clothing instead. And into that gap stepped a young New York socialite named Mary Phelps Jacob. In 1913, 4 years before the government's request, Jacob had been getting dressed for a debutante ball when she realized her rigid corset was visible through the sheer fabric of her gown. Frustrated, she grabbed 2 silk handkerchiefs, some ribbon and cord, and stitched together a simple, soft garment that covered and supported her chest without a single piece of boning. It worked so well that friends began asking her to make more. In 1914, she patented her design under the name backless brassiere, describing a garment so lightweight it felt, in her own words, like nothing at all. She eventually sold the patent to the Warner Brothers Corset Company for $1,500, a deal she would later estimate cost her over $15 million in royalties over the following decades. It's one of history's most expensive impulse decisions, and almost nobody remembers her name for it. Jacob's invention arrived at exactly the right cultural moment. Combined with wartime steel shortages and decades of reform movement pressure, the loose, soft, unboned bust supporter finally had room to become mainstream. By the 1920s, the flapper silhouette demanded a flattened chest rather than an accentuated one, and early bras were designed to minimize curves, not enhance them, a strange echo of the medieval kirtle, 700 years earlier, doing exactly the same thing for exactly the same cultural reason. Fashion once again deciding what a woman's body was allowed to look like. It wouldn't be until the 1930s when designers began engineering cup sizing, a genuine innovation credited largely to a company called Warner's, which introduced the A-B-C-D cup system still used today, that the modern bra as we recognize it fully emerged. Before we go further, here's something worth sitting with for a second. If you had lived in any of these eras, ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Victorian England, wartime America, what do you think you would have worn, and why? Drop the word that comes to mind for you in the comments below. I'm curious how many different answers show up. While European fashion history dominates most retellings of this story, breast support existed independently across cultures that had no contact with Western Europe at all. In parts of historical India, the kanchuki and later the choli served as fitted bodices worn beneath saris, some dating back over 1,000 years, designed with regional variation to suit climate, class, and modesty customs entirely distinct from European corsetry. In Japan, women traditionally bound the chest using a garment called the hifu, or later simpler wrapped cloth, particularly under kimono, where a flattened silhouette, not an accentuated one, was historically considered elegant. Another striking parallel to European flapper fashion emerging thousands of miles away and centuries apart, apparently without any shared influence. In parts of West Africa, breast support was often minimal or non-existent by design, not from lack of ingenuity, but because covering the chest simply wasn't attached to the same moral framework that shaped European Christian modesty codes. Colonial administrators in the 19th century frequently misread this as a lack of civilization, when in reality it reflected an entirely different cultural relationship to the body, one that had nothing to do with technological or social backwardness. This matters because so much of what gets called the history of the bra in popular retellings is really just the history of European and American undergarments. The broader story is messier, more diverse, and frankly more interesting. A reminder that the same basic problem, how to support the body during movement and labor, produced wildly different solutions depending on climate, religion, class, and culture. Here's the frustrating truth underlying this entire story. Textiles rot, fabric decomposes. Unlike pottery, metal, or stone, the vast majority of ancient and medieval undergarments simply did not survive the centuries required to reach modern archaeologists. The Lengberg Castle find from 2008 was extraordinary precisely because it was so rare. A set of near-perfect environmental conditions, sealed floorboards, dry air, that preserved fabric fragments nobody expected to still exist. For every garment like that which survives, historians estimate countless thousands simply vanished, taking their secrets with them. This means the history you've just heard is, by necessity, incomplete. Historians are essentially assembling a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, relying on rare textile finds, artwork, written references, and educated extrapolation to fill enormous gaps. New discoveries continue to reshape the timeline. It's entirely possible that somewhere, in a castle wall or a sealed tomb, or a forgotten trunk, another Lengberg-style discovery is waiting that could rewrite this story again. That uncertainty isn't a weakness in the historical record. It's a reminder of how much of women's daily, lived experience across history has simply been erased by time, by neglect, and by a society that for most of recorded history didn't think it was worth writing down. So think back to Hermione Cadol, standing in her Paris workshop in 1889, cutting a corset in half. She wasn't inventing something entirely new. She was, in a very real sense, reaching back across 2,000 years to something ancient Roman athletes already understood on those mosaic floors in Sicily, that the human body, in motion, needs support, not suppression. Between those 2 points in history sits an extraordinary, often painful, sometimes absurd journey. Whalebone and iron, steel shortages and battleships, flour paste stiffened into cardboard, a teenager's frustration with a see-through gown solved with 2 silk handkerchiefs and some ribbon, reformers labeled radical for suggesting women deserved to breathe. The story of what women wore before the bra existed isn't really a story about fabric and boning at all. It's a story about who gets to decide what a woman's body should look like, and how long it took for women themselves to start making that decision. The next time you get dressed in the morning, you might think about Mary Phelps Jacob, sitting on the floor of her bedroom in 1913, quietly inventing something she thought would only solve her own small personal problem, never imagining it would outlive her by more than a century. If this kind of hidden history is something you want more of, the stories behind the ordinary objects nobody thinks to question, subscribe, because there are a lot more of them waiting to be told.